Nobody told me Caleb Rourke's name that first night he came in off the Cutler Road. Mabel didn't ask it, and I didn't think to. A man rides into a way station in October sleet, half slid from his horse, coat so thin you could read a brand through it, and you don't interrogate him. You take his animal, you put him by the stove. That was Mabel Price's way, and it was the way her husband had kept before he died. And it was the way that way station on Harrow Flats had run since before I hired on as hostler, which was going on 11 years by then. I'm telling this from a long way out. I'm 81 years old, and I've been sitting on the same bench on the same south-facing porch at what used to be Price Way Station, and is now called the Rourke Price Rest for going on 40 years. My knees don't work and my eyes are dim in one, but my memory of that October night is as clean as water. Some things fix themselves in a man. That night fixed itself in me because of what grew out of it, and what grew out of it was the biggest surprise of my life, and I have lived a long life full of surprises. The way station sat on a flat stretch of the Cutler Road in what was then called Harrow Flats, Wyoming Territory, in the year 1879. The road ran freight and travelers between the railhead at Dunmore and the mining country up in the Absaroka passes, and in a good year it kept Mabel's station busy enough. Travelers stopped for water, grain, a meal, and a bunk if the weather was bad. That was the trade. Her husband Ellard had built the station and the corral and the 3 bunk rooms in the back, and when he died of a chest sickness 4 winters prior, Mabel had kept it running. Alone. With me as her only hired hand, and I was 60 at the time and not much good for heavy work anymore, and she knew it and hired me anyway, which told you something about Mabel Price right there. It had been a drought year, not the kind of drought that makes the newspapers in the East and becomes a word politicians use. The quiet kind, where the grass goes yellow in June and doesn't come back, and the wells drop 6 inches every week. And by August the freight wagons start taking the Platte River route instead because there's water there and there's nothing here. Traffic on Cutler Road had been thin since midsummer. By October it was nearly nothing. I had watered maybe 4 horses all that week, and Mabel had served 2 meals to a surveying party who camped one night and were gone before dawn. The creditors had started riding out from Calico Bend, which was the supply town 8 miles south of us on the same road. There were 2 of them who came regularly. Merritt Holt, who held paper on the station building itself. Ellard had borrowed against it to put up the 2nd bunk room, and Mabel had been servicing the debt careful and on time until the drought year cut her income to half and then less. And a man named Creel, who supplied her grain and lamp oil on account, and whose account had been running long for 3 months. They were not cruel men, exactly. They were money men in a hard country, and the money was real, and they wanted it, and they came out politely enough and waited while she counted what she had and made arrangements, and they rode back to town. But the visits were getting closer together, and I could see in her face, in the way she sat at the table with her account book after supper, working the numbers in a silence that had no good answer, that the station was coming to its edge. She didn't tell me that directly. Mabel Price was not a woman who announced her difficulties. She was 44 years old that autumn, with gray starting at her temples and hands that showed every year of the work she'd done, and she stood straight as a fence post and spoke plain and kept her affairs to herself, unless she needed something from you specifically. What she needed from me was the horses watered and the corral sound and the bunk rooms clean, and she got all 3, and that was our arrangement. She fed me my meals and paid me a small wage, and we understood each other without much said. In 11 years, we had built a kind of quiet, and in that quiet I had watched her, and I knew the station was in trouble before she told me a word of it. So the night the stranger came in. It was past 8 in the evening, which was late for a traveler on Cutler Road. The sleet had started around sundown, a miserable, flat, horizontal sleet that came off the flats sideways and found every gap in your coat. And I had written off any business for the night, and was in the tack room with a blanket over my shoulders working a creak out of a bridle when I heard hooves on the frozen mud of the yard. I went out with the lantern. The horse was a decent bay, travel-worn and hollow-flanked, blowing hard. The man on it was worse. He was somewhere in his middle years, I thought, though it was hard to say because his face was weathered past easy reading. A lean, long-jawed face, clean-shaved, with eyes so dark they looked almost black in the lantern light. He wore a coat that had been good once, years ago, and was now a collection of mended tears and thin places. He had a saddlebag and a bedroll and a rifle in the scabbard, and that was the entirety of his worldly situation as far as I could tell. He looked at me from the horse and said, "Can you take him? I'll pay in the morning. I have something to settle with in the morning." He meant the horse. He was near the end of himself. I could hear it in the careful way he was forming words, the way a man does when he's been cold so long that his mind has gone to a narrow place and is concentrating entirely on staying upright. I took the horse. I told him the main room was through the front door. He got down from the saddle slow, the way a man does when he doesn't trust his legs, and he walked across the yard and through the door, and I took the bay inside and got him hay and a blanket and went back to see about the man. Mabel had him at the stove by then. She hadn't come out to see who it was, hadn't asked me any questions, had simply heard the door and put a cup of coffee in front of the stove and waited. He had his hands around the cup and was working the feeling back into his fingers, and she was at the kitchen table setting out a plate. Cold biscuits from supper, a wedge of hard cheese, and a slice of bread. I want you to understand what that bread meant. It was late October, the drought year, traffic nearly nothing. Mabel baked twice a week when times were good. In the drought year she baked when she had enough flour to justify the use of wood for the stove, which was less and less often. I know, because I kept track without meaning to, the way you track the small things in a place where you've lived a long time. The loaf on that table had been the last of the flour she had. She had baked it that morning, and I had seen her slice it down to use at supper, and there had been maybe a third of it left when she put it away. She set that third on the plate in front of the stranger without a word, and without hesitation. He looked at the plate and then at her, and there was something in his face that I cannot quite name. Not gratitude exactly, or not only that, something harder than gratitude. Like a man who has been away from simple human decency for so long that the sight of it does something to him he wasn't prepared for. He said, "I appreciate this." She said, "Eat." He ate. She poured more coffee. She did not ask his name, where he was from, where he was going, what his business was. When he had finished the plate, she showed him to the first bunk room and told him breakfast was at 7, and she'd have his horse ready if he needed an early start. He said, "What do I owe you?" She said her rates, a bunk and supper and breakfast for $1, grain for the horse separately, standard price way station rates. He said, "I'll settle in the morning." She said that was fine, said good night and left him. He settled in the morning. He was up before she was, which surprised me, and he found me in the corral and asked about his horse, and I told him the bay had eaten well and was sound. He paid me Mabel's rate, he had the $1, and he paid for 2 nights' grain. And he stood there for a moment in the early cold of the corral and looked out at the road, and then he looked back at me. He said, "The woman who keeps this station." I said, "Mrs. Price." He said, "She's managing alone." I said, "She has me." He looked at me a moment with those dark eyes, and I had the feeling he was doing some kind of arithmetic that had nothing to do with the $1 he'd just paid. Then he said, "All right," and he saddled the bay himself without asking for help, and he rode south on the Cutler Road toward Calico Bend, and that was the last I thought I'd see of him. Mabel didn't speak of him. She put the $1 in the account book and went about her day. 6 weeks passed. In those 6 weeks, the Cutler Road gave us almost nothing. A small freight outfit came through in early November, 3 wagons, and that kept us for a week. After that, nothing worth noting. Merritt Holt rode out twice in November. The second time he stayed an hour in the main room talking to Mabel in the low, careful way that money men talk when they are working toward a point they'd rather not say out loud. I was in the tack room and I could not hear the words, but I could hear the tone, and the tone was, "Time is getting short, Mrs. Price. Time is getting short." She saw him out and came back and sat at the table with her account book, and I could see her adding what she had against what she owed, and finding the same answer she'd been finding for 3 months, which was not enough. I did not know what to say to her. I am not a man of many words at the best of times, and there was nothing useful I could say. What I could do was work, so I worked. I fixed the east fence of the corral that had been leaning since summer. I rechinked the worst gaps in the bunk room walls against the winter wind. I kept everything as tight and clean and sound as a one-man operation could keep it. It felt like the only argument I could make for the station's survival, to keep it in good order, and so I made it. Mabel baked when she could and kept the lamp oil low when no travelers were expected, and slept fewer hours than she should have, and was up before me every morning. She did not complain. She did not ask anything of me beyond my ordinary duties. She wrote letters in the evenings, which I assumed were to whatever family she had, though she rarely spoke of family, and she kept her accounts and she kept going. I watched her and I thought, this is what it looks like when a person decides to stand their ground until the ground decides for them. I've seen men look that way, soldiers mostly, men who know the odds and have decided to fight the odds anyway, not because they expect to win, but because fighting is what they have. Mabel Price looked that way through those 6 weeks, and it made me proud to work for her and sorry I couldn't do more. The morning Caleb Rourke came back down the Cutler Road. I was out in the corral just after sunrise graining the 2 horses we kept for station use, Mabel's gray and the old roan I used for errands. The road ran north-south straight as a ruler across the flat, and in the clear cold of early December you could see a long way. I saw the dust first, which surprised me, because the ground was half frozen, and it takes horses moving at some pace to kick dust off frozen ground. Then I saw why. There were a lot of horses. I counted later. There were 19 riders in total, plus 2 freight wagons, plus a man driving a buckboard with what appeared to be lumber stacked on it, plus Caleb Rourke at the front of all of it on the same bay horse he'd ridden in on 6 weeks before. 19 riders and 3 loaded vehicles, coming down the Cutler Road toward Price Way Station at a steady working trot. I stood at the fence and stared. Rourke pulled up in the yard and stepped down and tied the bay himself and walked over to where I stood with my grain bucket, and he looked at me with those dark eyes and said, "Is Mrs. Price in?" I said she was. I said, "Who are all these people?" He said, "Mine." He walked to the main door and knocked. Mabel answered, and she looked at him and did not show what she was thinking. She had a good face for that. And then she looked past him at the riders settling in the yard, and then she looked back at him. She said, "Mr." He said, "Rourke, Caleb Rourke. I stayed here 6 weeks ago." She said, "I remember." And then, because she was Mabel Price and practicality was her first language, 19 men and 3 rigs, that's a fair amount of grain. He said, "Yes, ma'am, I'll pay for all of it. And I'd like to talk to you about something else if you'll give me an hour." She gave him an hour. She gave him the table in the main room and 2 cups of coffee, and she sent me to deal with the riders and the animals, which kept me busy. By the time I got back to where I could hear, they had been talking for some time, and what I heard when I came in with an armload of wood for the stove was the tail end of what he was explaining to her. He was a land agent. That was what he was and had been for some years. He worked for a territorial land company out of Dunmore, a company that acquired and developed tracts along freight roads, water rights, station rights, improvement rights, and he had been on that October night in the middle of a scouting ride that had gone badly wrong. His supplies lost, his camp partner separated from him in a storm 2 days prior, himself down to the dregs of what his horse and coat could do. He had made the Cutler Road on instinct more than plan, And the light in Price Way Station had been what saved him. He had made his way back to Dunmore. He had filed his report. And somewhere in the filing of that report, looking at the maps and the water rights along the Cutler Road corridor, he had kept coming back to the way station at Harrow Flats, to the woman who ran it, to what he had seen of its condition and its situation in one October evening, and to the loaf of bread she had set in front of him without asking anything in return. What he was proposing was this. The land company wanted a permanent, improved station on the Cutler Road, water, bunk capacity, freight storage, a small farrier operation. The Price Way Station sat on exactly the right piece of ground. They would invest in the improvements, clear the existing debts, and set up a formal operating agreement. The terms were, Mabel retained ownership of the station and the property. She operated it and took a share of all traffic revenue. The company took a share. The arrangement ran for 7 years, after which she could buy out the company's share at a fixed price that was written into the agreement, or continue the partnership if both parties chose. He slid a paper across the table. The terms were written on it. He had brought a copy for her to keep. I had come in by then with the wood, and I set it down as quiet as I could, and stayed near the stove and said nothing, because I could see that this was a moment that wanted to be handled carefully, and I was not going to interrupt it. Mabel picked up the paper. She read it. She read it again slowly, the way she read her account book with full attention, moving nothing until she was sure she understood what she was looking at. When she put it down, she looked at Rourke and she said, "Why?" He said, "The ground makes sense." She said, "There are other grounds along this road." He said, "There are." She looked at him. He looked at her. And then he said, "You fed a stranger your last bread and asked nothing for it, Mrs. Price. A man keeps track of a thing like that." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "If I sign this, I want 2 changes to the terms." He said, "Tell me." She told him. I don't remember the exact language now, but the substance was. She wanted the buyout price fixed not to a calendar but to a revenue threshold, so that if the road traffic built faster than expected, she could buy her independence back sooner. And she wanted the right to take on her own additional hired staff without seeking the company's approval. Her station, her people. Rourke listened to both changes and he said, without any visible hesitation, "Both are reasonable. I'll have the revised agreement drawn up in Dunmore. You'll have it inside 2 weeks." She said, "Then we have a deal." She put her hand across the table and he shook it, and that was that. The riders stayed 3 days, which was the best stretch of business Price Way Station had seen in the drought year, and when they left, Mabel took what they'd paid and settled her account with Merritt, Holt and Creel in full, same week. Holt looked at the money on his desk with an expression I heard about later from the man who swept his office, which was the expression of a man who had been confident of a certain outcome and now had to readjust. He took the money. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. The revised agreement came in 12 days. Mabel read it, confirmed her changes were in, and signed it. I witnessed it. The improvement crew arrived in January, carpenters and a waterman and 2 laborers, and they put up the freight storage shed and doubled the bunk capacity, and dug a new well that came in at 32 feet with good water. The farrier operation was in place by spring. By the time the freight road opened up full in March, the station at Harrow Flats had become, in the span of 4 months, a different thing entirely from what it had been in October. Traffic came back. It came back because the improvements were real and the water was reliable, and the word got up and down the road that Price Way Station was the place to stop on the Cutler corridor. By summer, it was the best watered station between Dunmore and the Upsaroka passes, and Mabel hired 2 men to help me because the work had grown past what one aging hostler could manage, and she was taking in more revenue in a month than she had in the whole drought year. Rourke came through 4 times that year on company business, which took him up and down the Cutler Road with some regularity. He always stopped. He always found something that needed improving or something that could be better arranged, and he had the authority to arrange it, and he used that authority without any fuss. He and Mabel talked business at the table in the main room, and gradually, as the year turned, the talking went a little past business. Not much. They were both careful people. But I watched, from my bench in the main room where I oiled tack and pretended not to notice things, and I could see the thing that was building between them the way you can see a fire starting before the flame is large. A banked heat, a steadiness, the way two people's silences start to fit each other like a hand fits a glove. There was an evening in October, the first October after he had come back, so almost exactly a year from the night he rode in from the sleet, when they sat on the porch after supper with coffee. I was inside, close enough to hear. They were quiet for a long time. Then Mabel said something I remember word for word, because it was the most she had said about her interior life in 11 years of my acquaintance with her. She said I was not going to make it, that winter. Rourke said, I know. She said I had another month maybe. He said, I know. She said, I am not telling you so that you'll feel you did something necessary. I'm telling you because I want you to understand that I am not going to mistake gratitude for something else, and I do not want you to either. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Mrs. Price, Mabel, I stopped coming back for the station 6 months ago. She said, I know that too. They were quiet again. Then she said, will you come back in November? He said, yes. She said, good. That was the whole of it, as far as I heard. But I had been alive long enough to know that that was a great deal, between two people who did not spend their words carelessly. He came back in November. He came back in December. By the spring of the second year, he had moved his base of operations to Calico Bend, which put him 8 miles from Harrow Flats, which was a deliberate thing, and everyone knew it was deliberate. They were married in June of that second year, in the main room of the station, with the freight drivers and the 2 hired men and Merritt Holt in attendance, Holt looking somewhat more humble than he had been in the habit of looking, and a minister from Calico Bend who did a short and decent service. Mabel wore a gray dress that she had made herself and looked exactly like herself, which was the finest thing she could look like. Rourke wore a clean coat, a real one, which was a considerable improvement over the coat he had arrived in, and he stood very straight and said what he meant, and that was all that needed saying. I stood near the window because my knees didn't want me to stand anywhere I couldn't find support, and I watched them and I thought about the bread. It is a strange thing to trace a life back to a single act and find that the act holds. A third of a loaf of bread given to a stranger in the sleet. No calculation in it. No expectation. Mabel Price had been a woman who gave things because giving was her character, and her character did not change based on how much she had. She had almost nothing that October night, and she gave what she had because a man was cold and hungry, and it was in her power to help him. That was the whole of it. And out of that had come the improved well and the freight shed and the doubled bunk rooms and the agreement that bought her freedom from the creditors and the traffic that built through the summer and the man who had come back and the man who now stood before a minister in her main room saying, I do. I have been told that the world does not work this way, that good acts go unrewarded most of the time, which is true enough. I've seen plenty of good acts go unrewarded. I am not telling this story as a lesson or a promise. I am telling it because I was there, and because it happened, and because some things deserve to be told by someone who saw them. Rourke bought out the company's share of the station in 4 years, which was 3 years faster than the agreement had assumed, because the traffic built fast on the Cutler Road, and the revenue threshold Mabel had insisted on writing into the terms was exactly right. He put the deed in both their names. She did not make a ceremony of this. She put the deed in the account book where she kept important papers, and she went back to running the station, which was what she did best and what she was happy doing. They had 7 years together, Mabel and Rourke, before the chest sickness took him in the winter of their 8th year. He was not a young man when they married, and the years on the road had not been kind to his body, and he went in February, quietly, in the room at the back of the station that had been the first bunk room, the room I had put him in on the October night he arrived. I don't know if he knew that. I like to think he did. Mabel kept the station. Of course she kept the station. She ran it for 11 more years after he died, until her own body said enough. And then she ran it from a chair on the porch for 2 years more. Which is to say, she continued to run it because the 2 men she had by then hired to manage the operations did nothing without checking with her first, and she had opinions about everything, and was right most of the time. She died in the spring. A good death as deaths go, in her own bed, in her own station, on her own land, in a life she had built by herself, and with one man who had come back to her out of a road she had not expected anything from. I am telling this because I was there. I am 81 years old and my knees don't work and one of my eyes is going dim, and I sit on this bench on the south-facing porch of what they call the Workprice Rest now, and the Cutler Road runs out in front of me the same as it always did, and I can still see, if I look at the right angle in the right light, the place in the yard where a man on a bay horse sat 19 riders and 2 freight wagons and a buckboard load of lumber. And how they came down that road in the early December cold like something Mabel Price had not asked for and had earned. She did not cry when he came back. She was not that kind of woman. What she did was read the terms twice and ask for the 2 changes that were rightfully hers and put her hand across the table and close the deal. I loved her like a daughter, though she was a grown woman when I met her and needed nothing from me but the work I gave her. I loved her because she was the kind of person who gives their last bread to a stranger in the sleet and asks nothing, and does not think of it afterward as a sacrifice, and is genuinely surprised when the stranger comes back. She was not performing generosity. She was just herself. That was the whole of her. The road runs out to the flat now in the afternoon light, and I sit with my coffee going cold in my hands, and I think about what I have seen on this road and what I have not seen, and what I know for certain from 60 years of watching people move through places like this, which is the following. The kind of person who gives their last loaf to a stranger is the kind of person who deserves to have that stranger come back. It doesn't always happen, but when it does, it is a thing worth accounting for. And I account for it here.